I thought I'd make a quick video of atheist responses to religious challenges. I've watched a lot of shows like The Atheist Experience and debates with Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and talks by them. And I enjoy them a lot, and I've learned a lot from them. And I enjoy seeing the engagement because they'll take apart an idea and discuss it step by step. And it's interesting to see. It gives me a whole new vocabulary to understand certain things I didn't have clarity about. Now, I'm an atheist. I always have a problem with how atheists respond to two religious challenges in particular, or two sort of arguments that religious people present to them. Usually it's, the three main religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The first one is when I'll see, for instance, The Atheist Experience. I always want this argument to come up, but the hosts never do. And they're really good at what they do, but I always have a problem with how this doesn't get discussed in response to religious people. So a religious person will call in and they'll challenge the hosts of The Atheist Experience, but this happens in many forums where people who are religious argue with atheists. They say, well, if you criticize us for having belief and faith in the Bible and in ideas about God, don't you have faith in atheism and evolution and astronomy or whatever? Now, not all religious people don't believe in evolution. A lot of people do, actually, but there are many who don't. They'll challenge them and say, well, don't you believe in whatever? You believe tomorrow that certain things are predictable. The sun will rise, you believe your car will start, or you believe in evolution even though you have never seen a monkey transform into a human. Something like that. You know, that's not what evolution is at all. It's over successive generations. But regardless of that, whether you believe in evolution or not, my problem with that challenge from religious people is always that there's different meanings to the word faith. Language is always imprecise. It's always changing. So I try and keep what I say as like basic and easy to understand as possible. So I don't typically try and make big overarching opinions on big ideas. Although saying I'm an atheist, that is an overall opinion, but it's impossible to defend that like in its entirety coherently, because you say, well, you're an atheist? Oh, but what about this? What about how we don't know what dark matter is? How do you know that's not God or whatever? So I just try and keep it specific to certain subjects. So when religious people make this challenge, my first problem is there are different definitions of words, and words change based on how we use them. So faith can mean several things. Faith has a religious connotation or a more common or colloquial one. That's why I don't even want to look at the word. I'll just break down, what do we mean by you believe that God authored the Bible thousands of years ago, and an atheist would believe that there is no God, and the Bible was just authored by humans. They would say, oh, don't you have faith in that? Yeah, that's like a religious belief then. My problem with it is faith can manifest in certain ways. So you can believe something, for instance, as a matter of scripture. Christians say they'll believe it as a virtue, like faith itself is the virtue. You're supposed to believe it essentially no matter what. Although they will say many times that science corroborates what's in the Bible. But regardless, there are contradictory claims in the Bible and need to be reconciled. There are people like Kent Hovind who say there absolutely are not. But even many religious scholars and Bible experts will acknowledge that there are mistakes in the Bible, there are mistranslations. We don't have the originals. We don't know who the original authors are for many of the books. There are certain books that were left out just because that's how the early church leaders decided to assemble the Bible. And so there's a belief that's the religious connotation of faith, meaning sort of an absolute, like you will believe it no matter what. And I'm not trying to use that pejoratively. I'm just saying, like, for lack of a better definition, it's believing in something that you don't have direct evidence for. It's what they say, like, it's a virtue to believe without seeing. It's better to believe without seeing. Ultimately, they're waiting for a reward for that. An atheist who has faith that evolution is true doesn't mean it in nearly the same way. Of course, an atheist can. There's no reason an atheist couldn't be brainwashed into believing evolution or global warming or whatever. The problem is with that kind of belief, like a belief in a scientific idea, for me, okay, I'll just bring it down to me. It doesn't work in the religious meaning of faith because, for one thing, I'll only believe it provisionally. Meaning it works and it's believable provided it's corroborated by certain evidence, provided that it's not discredited by other evidence. So astronomers used to believe that the whole universe was maybe like 3 billion years old, something like that. And then they started discovering things like the red shift and blue shift of stars, and the expansion of the universe isn't actually slowing, but it's actually going even faster. And it helped them determine that the universe is probably about 14 billion years old. So I'll believe things, but it's never an absolute belief. Now, atheists can have that. Again, there's nothing saying atheists can't be foolish or whatever. It's not like they'll think the same thing. But I'm saying to make an accurate as model of the great scheme of reality as possible, in as much as our minds can understand, I can only accept things. Even if I say, oh, I believe it absolutely, in reality, I can't really know something to a certainty, because everything I process is sort of subjective in a way. I have to be able to corroborate it, like evolution. You can corroborate it with genetics by looking at how different species have evolved in different parts of the earth, how certain structures in our bodies have similarities to species before us, like our hands have bones like the Devonian fish. We can look at the geological strata and say there are no anachronistic fossils, meaning you won't find a dinosaur from a period where it wouldn't have belonged, or a human fossil from 500 million years ago. The finer points of evolution are always open to revision. Here's the difference between belief in evolution and belief in the Bible or Christianity or God or Jesus. You couldn't in any coherent way say that those faiths or beliefs are the same when a belief in evolution could be discredited. So it's only provisional. It's not likely that evolution as a whole will be entirely discredited and completely supplanted by some other explanation for the diversity of life. But you could only sensibly believe it if it's corroborated by other evidence, and that if we can adduce evidence from the natural world and not in spite of it. So the difference between that kind of belief and religious belief is, for instance, I couldn't say about the Bible it's corroborated by lots of evidence, and that it's non-contradictory, and that the Bible makes verifiable claims. Now, some of them are verifiable, like we know that certain cities mentioned in the Bible actually did exist and certain peoples, but even so, that doesn't attest to all that it was divinely authored, because we have many examples of books that were written by humans, and none that we know of that were written by a supernatural deity. Basically, to sum it up, the difference between the colloquial term faith, or just belief in an idea, and religious belief is you can assent to an idea in the colloquial term, like an atheist would, and believe in something provisionally, meaning it's always provided that it's backed up by evidence, provided that it makes sense, that it works out, that you can corroborate it, that you don't see evidence that doesn't add up to a certain conclusion. The difference between that and religious belief is I can't sensibly say that I would believe in evolution even if there was evidence that showed it was discredited or that it wasn't true. It would only be religious belief if I believed it in spite of the fact that there's no evidence supporting it, or if I believed something that was totally unverifiable about evolution, or if I was willing to believe it no matter what, even if it was totally contradicted by the fossil record and genetics and whatever diversity of species around the world that would discredit evolution. I couldn't say, well, I'll believe it no matter what, even if all the evidence discredits it. That's the problem with saying that belief in a scientific theory or some natural process is like belief in religion, is that Christians believe the Bible, or other religious people, Jews just the Torah or in their holy books, or Muslims or whoever. They'll believe it, one, not only with a lack of evidence for those books of validity, but in spite of totally contradictory evidence, and in spite of the fact that we have lots of evidence that totally upends stories in the Bible, like creation of the earth in 7 days, a massive flood all around the world, so many stories of miracles which not only have no way of being verified, but even with people who claim miracles today and claim to have witnessed them, there's still no way of verifying that. And what's much more likely is that somebody has been mistaken or somebody is lying. We have plenty of examples of that. Plenty of examples of books that were misinterpreted or misunderstood. Why it makes sense to say that faith in a scientific idea is the same as believing in the Bible, or Christianity or Islam or Judaism, when belief in those things is the virtue in itself. It means believing not only notwithstanding the lack of evidence to support those ideas in the Bible or other holy books, but even believing them when they're totally contradicted by evidence, such as no evidence for a global flood, or the creation of the earth in 7 days, or the earth being 6,000 years old, or 10,000 years old, depending on what you believe, or in the idea now of intelligent design, which has no supporting evidence. It's sort of having a conclusion and working backwards to try and make it track to reality. And the other big difference is, I don't say you have to believe in evolution or you will be punished forever after you die. Meaning this isn't just an idea you assent to, but this is something you believe somehow makes you righteous, or somehow is approved of by an all-powerful being, or that somehow gives you passage to a world of endless pleasure. The other one real quick I'll mention is when religious people question, well, where do you get the idea of right and wrong from, and how can you have any sense of right and wrong if there is no God? Because without a God, you can pick and choose anything you want to be right and wrong. You could kill, steal, hurt people, and lie, and it wouldn't matter. My problem with that is very simple, which is, why is that a hypothetical to you that could happen? We live in that world where people do make that choice to do that. So it seems almost like a tacit, unwilling acknowledgement of the idea that we do live in a world that looks exactly how it would look if there was no God. Meaning, right and wrong isn't somehow a matter of like physics, where you cannot violate those rules no matter what. That's a weird thing. It's like the Christians, especially in particular, will mention the first half, but I mean all the major religions depends on some level on this. Not always, and not for all of the members of those religions, but they claim that without an authority like that's all powerful prescribing what is right and wrong, that means that you would be able to choose whatever you want is right and wrong. But why is that a hypothetical to them? Again, that's the world we live in. People do kill and do get away with horrible stuff. It's almost like saying, oh, yeah, like, well, the world is like that, but let's pretend it isn't, and pretend there's a right and wrong that's absolute and fixed, and that you will be punished for if you violate after you die, of course. That quandary isn't lost on Christians, because they still have to decide in every moment of their lives what they're going to accept from Christianity, what they won't, what Christianity means to them. There are as many different versions of any religion as there are adherents of that religion. Christians don't have an all-encompassing clear guide on what to do. This is a reality that we all do have to choose in any given moment what is acceptable behavior and what isn't. And they say, well, what then? You could just kill people and whatever. You could just, but again, they have this weird, like, almost like they're pretending like the world isn't real and it's like a hypothetical, saying, but then you could just kill people and it wouldn't even matter, could you? Or you could just steal or whatever else. The problem for them is always, but that does happen. So what are they saying? That we are in a world where there is no God? They never finish that argument, as if somehow their acceptance of the idea that a Bible prescribes right and wrong and their church teachings will somehow then sort of make everything concrete and then it'll work. Because the Bible and Christianity doesn't give you an actual moment-by-moment understanding of what's right or wrong. There are always situations arising where we have to determine for ourselves what's acceptable and what isn't. And for the people who do commit crimes and kill or do bad things, and pretty much everybody does something bad, the problem doesn't go away just because you can say, well, God says this is wrong, because you still have to choose to adhere to that idea. It's always a choice in any given moment. And they say, well, what about then? People are gonna, like, say for instance, whole societies where people start killing, like murderous dictatorships. We can just look at the consequences of that. And so they say, well, how do you know what's right or wrong? Well, I can say basically what works, which is, if we all wanted to steal and kill each other and lie and hurt each other, we wouldn't have very pleasant lives. Like, those things hurt. That's primarily how we determine what's right and what's good or bad, not by some arbitrary, think about it. There are things that churches say are wrong that most people do anyways because they don't really hurt anyone, like masturbation they can say is wrong. It's not quite as controversial an issue. I mean, it can be, and it has been throughout history, but it's not something as forceful or impactful unless you want it to be, like unless you basically believe it is and you react to it as, say, something that somebody can do to you to victimize you. We could just look at what happens. If people are willing to do that, then there's going to be lots of pain, lots of misery, and in societies where that happens, or for instance, whole armies killing each other, it's not sustainable. They're going to end up wiping each other out, killing themselves, killing each other. I'm not saying they'll completely will. I'm saying for the people engaged in that, in a very common colloquial term of survival and thriving and happiness, those societies don't work out as long. Now you could say, well, what, they still exist? You know, there's still murderous dictatorships and gangs, whatever. Yes, they do exist. It's up to us to decide whether that's acceptable or not. They've obviously chosen, and they have to choose in every moment. But the idea that somehow this is some hypothetical world where people can choose right and wrong for themselves at any given moment is always so absurd, and atheists don't really ever fully take that on and respond to that by saying we do live in that world. So are you implying that we live in a world that looks exactly how it would look if there was no God? So for instance, we could just say Nazi Germany. It's not that I'm saying it's guaranteed that every person who has like some commonality with that society will die off and a good society will live on. It's just that there's going to be this tendency within people who kill and end up being killed to not reproduce, to create misery, pain, to hinder people's abilities to create lives for ourselves and technology that give us things we want in life. And it's not that that it's an inherent, like a given of the universe, that things like cooperation and decency are good, but those work out for us. Somehow the world ended up that way, where things like cooperation and working with each other and thinking about the future and wanting to survive for the future and, you know, working hard for others and caring about others. But it's 100% a natural phenomenon of choosing to do something that we consider good or bad. It's nothing supernatural. So we have to decide whether we're going to be the ones who create societies and families where things like cooperation and decency and civility allow us to live lives that are enjoyable, or we can choose otherwise. But there's nothing supernatural about that, and there's nothing that's fixed by pointing to a Bible or a religious book. That is something people do choose and choose otherwise every day. And it just so happens that the way life currently exists is there's a tendency, among other tendencies that work against it, for things like decency and civility to give us greater pleasure. Again, one tendency among many others, because there are those who kill and enjoy it. And obviously, if most of the world was like that, there wouldn't be much of a world. It's not like right or wrong needs to even come into it. We can just look at it and say, that wouldn't be much of a world. And we can look at places in the world where that does happen, whether small or large, whether it's just one person killing another or a whole army killing another army or population. That doesn't work out very well. It's painful, it's horrendous, it damages people. And so that's my answer to this, to the question of, well, how do you get right and wrong without an absolute standard? Is, first of all, the religious person has no access to any information outside of me of what's right or wrong. They still have to decide for themselves whether they're going to agree with every part of their religious doctrine, which inevitably seem human-made. I mean, especially when you get into the misogynistic stuff about, for instance, in the Bible, men are supposed to be dominant over their wives, and Paul writing that women should be covered up in church and not speak. In the Old Testament, orders to take women for yourselves when the Jews would attack other civilizations, and basically you can make them your bride, or things like that. It sounds a lot like stuff that was written by men. Or would you say, no, nothing man-made about that? That sounds like something a god would say. There are all kinds of horrible, horrible scenarios in the Bible that God condones or orders or just remains silent on. There's obligations of children to parents. That's great for the preservation of religion. Nothing really about the obligation of parents to children other than beat them and kill them if they don't respect the Sabbath. Even if we could say, well, the Bible is perfectly decent and civil and only says good things, I couldn't point to anything that seems supernatural about it. And on top of that, we still have the dilemma in every moment of dealing with the consequences of behavior. For instance, let's think of the counterexample. Let's just take a simple example instead of the example of murder. Stealing. I don't think stealing's good. I don't like stealing, and that's just putting it modestly. And I think it's a sensible, a good thing that stealing is criminal for the most part. Much of the world, stealing is looked down upon. Now, in places where it isn't, or where it's more acceptable, it's obviously going to be disruptive to people's lives. At a certain point, if you steal a penny from someone who's rich, it wouldn't be that disruptive to them. Still not good, and it still shows something bad that sort of the person who steals is doing to themselves by sort of not being willing to respect another person and what they have. But that's all you can say about it in a way, the natural consequences. And it's funny how Christians say, like, well, you don't have a sense, how can you get a sense of right and wrong? I can say exactly what happens and what's workable and what isn't. So if people regularly steal from each other, that tends to breed all kinds of conflict. Even if it's not a problem in and of itself, that's very big, like stealing a penny from a rich person. But we can see clearly, okay, well, stealing a penny isn't as bad as stealing someone's life savings. But we can see what happens when you steal someone's life savings. We can imagine we wouldn't want that for ourselves, and that's the kind of thing that breeds more workable civilization, is when people do want to cooperate with each other. It's not some mysterious supernatural thing like, well, what happens after everyone steals? There are going to be consequences. And if there aren't, and if the people who steal truly don't believe there's anything bad in what they're doing, it's going to happen. We know that's going to happen, and people do that. So it's up to us to decide whether that's acceptable or not. Ultimately, some people have to be able to build and sustain a civilization. So if everyone's stealing, that's not very workable, and if less people are stealing, that's not as less workable, still not good, but you can see the consequences of what are going to come from that and identify what's preferable to you and what isn't. People will find rationalizations and excuses to steal, obviously, even people who otherwise are very decent. That's just reality, is they will choose that. What do you mean? Even Christians do it. They have to do it in every moment. There's nothing churches or synagogues or temples or mosques do to sort of fundamentally solve that problem. In fact, many of them just say, well, you just ask forgiveness and whatever you did is fine. Like, you get saved. And then you get rewarded forever on top of that. Hitler kills millions of people, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Kim Jong-il. And then, if they ask forgiveness, well, all's forgiven then. It's all right. And they'll get rewarded forever. But the person who stole one penny, if they're not sorry, well, they're going to be punished forever. And that makes sense. That's just. So I could go on about, I didn't even want to go this long, about all the contradictions and holes in religious views about the idea of how can you accept anything as true, because for them, the Bible is just as certainly true as anything else, or other religions with their holy books and their teachings. And how do you get a sense of right and wrong? How can you have any right and wrong without it being prescribed by a religious teaching? Which, again, it doesn't even solve the problem, because first of all, you have to accept that the religious teaching even holds up to some standard that you accept of right and wrong. It doesn't just become this fixed concrete thing you can go out and find, and that's where it is. That's where right and wrong resides, and we know it. It's still always something we have to figure out in different situations. We can see in places where people steal more, life isn't as sustainable. It still may be perfectly sustainable as far as yes, biologically living, and people can make a living, but there are going to be obstacles in your lives, and we can decide, do we want those or not? That's nothing supernatural about what I said. I don't have to refer to any supernaturally authored source. Things that Christianity prescribes, for instance, that have nothing to do with well-being, like, for instance, not going to church on Sundays. That can get you sent to hell, supposedly. What the hell does that have to do with right and wrong, good or bad, decency and civility? Things like sexual sin, lust, masturbation, what those have to do with well-being or good or bad, makes no sense. I can think of other things, certain dietary restrictions, homosexuality, all kinds of superstitions, basically, that have no bearing on right and wrong, and can be totally antithetical to things that are good or bad. Fostering homophobia, for instance, horrible, horrible thing. Religious driven wars, horrible. And it's funny, by the way, too, I've heard religious people call into the atheist experience and even sort of admit that at least accepting some version of God or religion, even if it's one they believe is false, will somehow give you a better moral guide, is like a tacit admission from them that it just comes down to each person. Basically, like, you're your own God. Like, if you believe in something that gives strong rules about punishments for right and wrong, you're going to tend to behave according to those rules. Maybe some people do. A lot of people seem to just live as if there is no afterlife, and yet that seems like an admission that yes, basically religion is good for keeping people in line, but it's man-made, or it has the same effects when from their own point of view it's man-made, because a lot of them still do insist on respecting each other's religions. And it's weird, whenever I hear the Pope say you shouldn't blaspheme, even when they're talking about people blaspheming Islam, it's like, wait, but you believe they're false. So are you just saying people should just be in line and believe in something? Just the belief is good. It's so ridiculous. It's so absurd. It leads to endless contradictions and a lot of unnecessary misery, and sort of focus on some false sense of purity that's totally disconnected from the actual world we live in favor of some distant, mysterious sense that you can somehow be pure absent reality. Like, you can be pure for some other thing that judges right and wrong as totally independent from what is actually decent and civil and acceptable. And I try and use those words instead of right and wrong, because even those are nebulous to me. I can't really define them in a way. I can only say what's acceptable and what isn't, and what the consequences will be of certain behaviors, and we can decide from there to exclude people and put them in prison or whatever, or try and get them reformed if they don't adhere to behaviors we like, or accept them. So we have to decide all that stuff. Religion doesn't solve any of those problems. In fact, it only compounds it when it gives proclamations that are totally in contradiction to things we know. Like saying homosexuality, if you act on that, it will get you sent to hell. Or some people just believe being gay will send you to hell. But I'll give the generous version of the Christian doctrine, which is that homosexual acts are bad and will get you sent to hell. Even stuff like that just causes misery for gay people who are hiding their sexual orientation, but also because that's an easy way for somebody else to feel superior to a gay person, is feeling like they're disordered and there's something that's bad. It's so ridiculous and so absurd. Again, nothing's solved by these religious proclamations. People do bad things, and we have to look at whether that's acceptable or not for us. And if we don't, and if we just say, well, they're acceptable, which many people do, that's going to happen. And sometimes those people win. There's no mystery to that. Anyways, there you go. That's my thought. I never really see that argument played out to religious people, so I just wanted to say that.